How did the slave trade affect Africa? This is one of the most important and most neglected questions in the standard telling of slave trade history. Most discussions focus, understandably, on what happened to enslaved Africans in the Americas: the Middle Passage, the plantations, the abolition movement, the legacy in the Caribbean and United States. These are essential stories. But the question of what the slave trade did to Africa, to the continent it drew from, to the kingdoms it destabilized, to the populations it depleted, to the economies it hollowed out, to the social structures it shattered, is almost completely absent from mainstream historical education. The answer is devastating. The transatlantic slave trade affected Africa in at least 9 distinct dimensions: demographically, economically, politically, militarily, culturally, psychologically, agriculturally, institutionally, and ecologically. In every dimension, the impact was catastrophic and long-lasting, extending through the mechanism of colonialism that followed into the present day. And here is the critical connection that most people don't make. The slave trade didn't just happen alongside Africa's underdevelopment, it caused it. The Harvard economist Nathan Nunn published research in 2008 demonstrating that the regions of Africa most severely affected by the slave trade have measurably lower GDP per capita today. Not somewhat lower, measurably, demonstrably lower. The connection between what was done to Africa 400 years ago and the condition of Africa today is not metaphorical, it is statistical and causal. Today we are going to trace those connections, from the first Portuguese voyage in 1441 to the world we live in now. Because you cannot understand contemporary Africa without understanding what was done to it. Welcome to Griot Wave Academy. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Let me give you the map before we walk through the territory. The slave trade's impact on Africa operated across 9 distinct dimensions. And I want you to hold all of them in mind as we work through today's video, because the power of understanding this history is in seeing how these dimensions interacted and reinforced each other. Demographic: 12.5 million people removed. The most productive segment, 15 to 35-year-olds. Entire generations simply absent from African villages, farms, and courts. Political: African kingdoms forced into an impossible choice: supply enslaved people or become enslaved people. Most were destabilized, trying to navigate this choice. Centuries of diplomatic order collapsed. Economic: the sophisticated African trade economies, the trans-Saharan gold networks, the Indian Ocean commerce, the internal West African markets, were disrupted and eventually hollowed out. Military: European firearms created an arms race that turned African kingdoms against each other in cycles of raid and counter-raid that destroyed regional stability. Cultural: the people who carried African knowledge, healers, craftspeople, farmers, griots, spiritual leaders, were removed. The knowledge died with them. And the crucial 6th dimension, the path to colonialism. This is the connection most people don't make. The slave trade didn't just coexist with colonialism, it made colonialism possible. By the time the Berlin Conference happened in 1884, Africa had been so systematically weakened, fragmented, and disrupted by 400 years of slave trade that 13 European nations were able to divide the entire continent among themselves in a single conference, without a single African representative present. The slave trade is the cause. The Berlin Conference and colonialism are the effects. Let's begin with the most basic dimension of impact: the people themselves. Because before we talk about economies or kingdoms or cultures, we need to understand what it means to remove 12.5 million people from a continent. The regional distribution matters enormously. The 12.5 million were not spread evenly across Africa, they were concentrated. West Central Africa, modern Angola, DRC, Congo-Brazzaville, provided approximately 5.7 million people, 45% of the total. The Kingdom of Congo, one of Africa's most sophisticated states, was so severely depleted that its king, Afonso I, wrote personal letters to the Portuguese king begging for the trade to stop. "Our land is entirely depopulated," he wrote in 1526. He was not speaking metaphorically. Entire villages were emptying. Farmers were disappearing from fields. The political infrastructure of the kingdom was collapsing. The Bight of Benin, the slave coast, provided approximately 2 million people. This is the home of the Yoruba, the Fon, the Iwi. Sophisticated kingdoms that found themselves simultaneously participating in and being destroyed by the slave trade. And the demographic profile of those taken, not random. The slave trade systematically selected prime working-age males, men between 15 and 35, at approximately a 2-to-1 ratio over women. This was the worst possible demographic selection for the societies losing them. You are taking the farmers, the warriors, the craftsmen, the traders, the future fathers. You are leaving behind the most vulnerable, the very young, the very old, the widows, the orphans. In some regions, particularly along the Bight of Benin and in the Congo Basin, scholars estimate that the pre-slave trade growth trajectory would have produced populations 50% larger by 1850 than actually existed. 50% larger. The demographic wound was generational. I want to bring this down to the village level, because 12.5 million is a number so large it can become abstract. Let me make it concrete. A village in the Bight of Biafra. It is night. The community has been farming this land for generations. The extended family compound at the center, the fields surrounding it, the communal granary, the shrine of the ancestors, the council house where elders meet. This is a functioning, productive, culturally rich society. A raid begins, possibly by a neighboring kingdom armed with European guns, possibly by organized African slave traders working for European merchants, possibly by a mixed European-African force. Within hours, houses are burned. Some community members are killed resisting. Others, the strongest, the youngest adults, are bound and marched away. The elderly, the very young, the injured, who cannot walk quickly, are left behind or killed. By morning, the village has lost perhaps 30 or 40 people and its ability to function. The farming system relied on those people. The defense of the community relied on those people. The knowledge embedded in those people. The healer who knew which plants treated which illness. The blacksmith who maintained the tools. The griot who held the community's history is gone with them. The survivors face impossible choices. Rebuild and risk being raided again. Flee into the forest. Move closer to a protective kingdom. Becoming dependent on that kingdom in ways that often meant contributing their own labor or people to the kingdom's slave trading activities. Multiply this by tens of thousands of communities across West and Central Africa, happening repeatedly over 400 years. That is what the slave trade did to Africa, at ground level. When demographers study the slave trade's impact on African populations, one of the most striking patterns they find is what's called the missing generation, a gap in the population pyramid where the working-age adults should be. The slave trade specifically targeted people aged 15 to 35, the most productive segment of any society. These are the farmers, the craftspeople, the warriors, the parents of the next generation. And men were taken at roughly twice the rate of women for the physically demanding labor of plantation agriculture. The consequences of this demographic targeting cascaded through every social system. Agriculture first. West African farming was predominantly a male labor system. Clearing forest for new fields, heavy cultivation, cattle herding. These required the physical strength that the slave trade specifically selected. Remove the men, and farming capacity collapses. The food surplus that supported population growth, that funded the kings and the craftspeople and the scholars, disappeared. Defense next. African kingdoms maintained their security through young male military capacity. Remove those young men, and you remove the kingdom's ability to defend itself, making the next raid easier, which removes more men, making the next raid easier still. This is a self-reinforcing cycle of vulnerability. And knowledge transmission. In oral cultures, specialized knowledge lives in people. The healer who knows which plants cure which disease has that knowledge, because she spent 20 years learning from her teacher. When you remove working-age adults, you break the chain of transmission. The knowledge of medicine, metallurgy, farming techniques, spiritual practice, dies with the person who held it, and was in the process of transmitting it to the next generation. One of the most consequential and least understood mechanisms of the slave trade's impact on Africa is what historians call the guns for slaves spiral. And understanding it is essential to understanding why the slave trade was so comprehensively destructive. Here is the logic. European merchants arrive on the West African coast with firearms. These are weapons that can change the outcome of warfare radically. A small group with muskets can defeat a much larger group without them. African rulers understand this immediately. The demand for firearms is intense. European merchants say, "We will trade you firearms for enslaved people." They need enslaved people for their plantations in the Americas. The exchange is made. Now the kingdom that has traded for firearms has military superiority over its neighbors. It uses this advantage to raid those neighbors, capture their people, and trade them for more firearms. The neighbors, to protect themselves, also need to trade enslaved people for firearms. And so on. Every African kingdom in the region is now trapped in the same logic. Raid or be raided. Supply enslaved people or become enslaved people. There is no option of remaining outside the system. The system has already destabilized everyone. The Dahomey example is instructive. Dahomey used firearms brilliantly, expanded dramatically, and became a major slave trading power. But in doing so, it oriented its entire economy around the slave trade. When Britain abolished the trade in 1807 and began enforcing that abolition, Dahome's economic foundation collapsed. A kingdom that had been sophisticated and powerful was left vulnerable, and was subsequently conquered by France. The gun trade is the mechanism by which external commercial pressure was converted into internal African self-destruction. The political history of Africa during the slave trade period is a history of impossible choices and tragic outcomes. Every African kingdom near the trade routes faced the same dilemma: participate in the slave trade and gain access to European weapons and goods, or refuse to participate and risk being raided and destroyed by kingdoms that did. There was no third option. The geography of the trade made non-participation equivalent to vulnerability. The Kingdom of Congo is the most poignant example. In 1491, Congo was a sovereign state that received Portuguese ambassadors as equals. Its king corresponded with the King of Portugal in Latin. It had its own ambassadors in Lisbon. By the 18th century, it was a shattered territorial fragment, its population depleted, its political structures destroyed by a combination of slave trade pressure and Portuguese military intervention. King Afonso I's 1526 letter to King João III of Portugal is one of the most important documents in this history. He wrote, "Every day people are enslaved and kidnapped, even nobles and even members of the king's own family. Our country is being completely depopulated, and your highness should not agree with this nor accept it as in your service." A sovereign African king, writing in Latin, begging a European king to stop the trade that was destroying his country. The letter was ignored. The Oyo Empire's collapse is equally instructive. For centuries, Oyo was West Africa's most powerful cavalry empire, with sophisticated constitutional governance. By the early 19th century, after 200 years of slave trade pressure, it had been destroyed by the combination of arms proliferation, internal power struggles over control of the trade, and external military pressure from rivals who had been armed by the trade. The slave trade did not find politically fragmented African societies. It created them. One of the most persistent myths about pre-colonial Africa is that it had no sophisticated economy, that it was a continent of subsistence farmers who had nothing the world wanted. This myth is historically wrong, and it has been used to minimize the economic damage done by the slave trade. Before the slave trade, Africa had a sophisticated commercial economy. The trans-Saharan gold trade, which had been running for over 1,000 years, connected West African goldfields to North African and Mediterranean markets. The Swahili coast connected East Africa to Arabia, India, and China. Internal West African markets traded gold, salt, cloth, and agricultural products. Timbuktu had markets for books, the most valuable commodity, according to the traveler Leo Africanus. Kumbi Saleh had separate commercial quarters for African and Arab merchants. Kilwa was one of the most beautiful cities Ibn Battuta had ever seen. This economy existed. It was real. It was sophisticated. And the slave trade destroyed it. How? In several ways. First, by orienting African commercial activity away from productive trade toward supplying human cargo. The time and energy of African kingdoms, their military capacity, their administrative focus, their commercial networks, was redirected toward the business of enslaving and transporting people. Second, by flooding African markets with cheap European manufactured goods, textiles, metal tools, alcohol, that undercut African craft production. Why weave cloth, when cheaper cloth comes from Europe in exchange for enslaved people? The craft industries that had supported African urban economies were undermined. Third, by removing the human capital, the farmers, the craftspeople, the traders, that the economy depended on. A market without merchants, a farm without farmers, a workshop without craftspeople. Nathan Nunn's 2008 study in the American Economic Review demonstrated this quantitatively. The regions of Africa most severely affected by the slave trade have statistically lower GDP per capita today. Not slightly lower, measurably, demonstrably, causally lower. Modern economists talk about human capital, the knowledge, skills, and capabilities that people carry in their minds and bodies, which are the foundation of economic productivity. The slave trade was, among other things, the largest theft of human capital in history. And it was a selective theft. Slave traders didn't take whoever was easiest to grab. They specifically selected the strongest, healthiest, most capable adults. This meant that African communities lost their most productive members, the people who were most capable of doing the work that kept the community functioning. West African agriculture was far more sophisticated than the stereotype of, quote, primitive subsistence farming allows. Specific varieties of sorghum, yams, and oil palms had been selected and developed over generations. Forest management systems. Many West African forests were managed ecosystems, not wild, had been maintained for centuries. Irrigation techniques, soil management practices, composting systems. This was genuine agricultural science, held in the minds and hands of the people who practiced it. When those people were taken, when the farmer who knew how to manage the land's drainage was captured and marched to the coast, the knowledge went with them. The community left behind was not just short of labor, it was short of the specific knowledge that made that labor productive. Same with metalwork. Blacksmiths were particularly valuable to slave traders. Strong, skilled, worth a premium price. But blacksmiths were also the people who made the iron hoes and axes that African farmers depended on. Remove the blacksmith, and the tools wear out and cannot be replaced. Remove the tools, and the farm becomes less productive. A cascade of practical knowledge loss, spreading through every dimension of community life. Let me address directly the argument that is sometimes used to deflect responsibility for the slave trade's impact on Africa. Africans were already fighting each other. The implication is that the slave trade simply channeled existing African warfare, and therefore Europeans can't be blamed for the resulting destruction. This argument fails historical scrutiny on 2 counts. First, it misrepresents the nature of pre-slave trade African warfare. Second, it ignores how European commercial pressure fundamentally transformed African conflict. Before European firearms arrived, African warfare was conducted with relatively comparable weapons across states. This relative balance of capability meant that conflict, while certainly present, was manageable through the diplomatic, tributary, and commercial mechanisms that sophisticated African states had developed over centuries. The same balance of power that exists in any region of comparable military capability. The introduction of European firearms into this environment was transformative. A musket is not simply a better bow. It changes the fundamental tactical equation. A small force with muskets can decisively defeat a much larger force without them. Every African kingdom now needed firearms for basic self-defense. And the only way to get firearms from European merchants was to provide enslaved people in exchange. So African warfare was transformed, from episodic territorial and political conflict, into continuous raiding specifically designed to capture people who could be traded for the weapons needed to conduct more raids. The purpose of warfare changed. The frequency of warfare increased. The destructiveness expanded. This transformation was not an African cultural phenomenon. It was an African response to European commercial pressure, delivered through European military technology. The cause is external. The destruction is internal and lasting. I want to talk about what is perhaps the hardest loss to quantify but the most devastating in human terms. The cultural destruction wrought by the slave trade in Africa itself. We tend to think of cultural destruction in the context of the diaspora, enslaved Africans in the Americas losing their languages, their religions, their names. And that is a real and profound loss. But the cultural destruction also happened in Africa, in the communities that were raided, disrupted, scattered, and depleted. The griot tradition is the clearest example. West African griots were the living libraries of their societies. Oral historians who spent years, sometimes decades, in training, memorizing the genealogies, legal traditions, diplomatic histories, and cultural knowledge of their communities. A griot in the 16th century might hold in his trained memory the history of his kingdom for 20 generations, names, events, laws, precedents, relationships. This knowledge was literally irreplaceable. It existed only in that person's mind. When that person was killed in a raid, or fled in terror and never returned, or was captured and enslaved, the knowledge went with them, permanently. There was no backup. There was no second copy. The history of a kingdom could be erased in a single night by a single death. And the family structure, African kinship systems, the extended family network, the clan, were not merely sentimental arrangements. They were the social infrastructure of African societies. They provided the safety net, the political authority, the cultural transmission mechanism. The slave trade's systematic separation of family members attacked this infrastructure directly, leaving children without parents, elders without grandchildren, communities without the generational connection that gave them meaning and coherence. This slide makes the argument that I consider the most important in this entire presentation. The transatlantic slave trade was the necessary precondition for European colonialism in Africa. This is not a common argument in mainstream historical education. The slave trade and colonialism are usually presented as sequential events that are related but not causally connected. First, the slave trade happened, then colonialism happened, but the causal connection is direct and can be demonstrated. By 1880, when the scramble for Africa began in earnest, most of Africa was still under African governance. 90% of the continent was independently governed by African states. But those states were not in the same condition they had been in 400 years earlier, before the slave trade. They had been systematically weakened, demographically depleted, politically fragmented, economically hollowed, militarily destabilized. The Berlin Conference of 1884, where 13 European powers divided the entire African continent among themselves in a single conference, was not a testament to European military superiority alone. It was a testament to how thoroughly 400 years of slave trade had prepared Africa for conquest. Ethiopia is the proof by exception. Ethiopia was not heavily affected by the Atlantic slave trade. It was geographically remote from the main trade routes. When Italy attempted to colonize it in 1896, Ethiopia's army, under Emperor Menelik II, defeated the Italian force at the Battle of Adwa. A fully functioning African state, not weakened by 400 years of slave trade, was able to resist European colonial conquest. Every other major African state that resisted European conquest did so at disadvantage, fighting with populations depleted, weapons disadvantages, and political fragmentation that were direct consequences of the slave trade. The slave trade didn't just precede colonialism, it enabled it. Let's talk about food. Because the agricultural consequences of the slave trade are among the most concrete and most damaging of its effects on Africa, and they are among the least discussed. Before the slave trade, West African agriculture was sophisticated. This bears repeating, because the colonial-era image of African subsistence farming is so deeply embedded in public consciousness. But the reality of West African agriculture at its pre-slave trade peak included complex polyculture systems that maintained soil fertility over long periods, agroforestry systems where the boundary between, quote, farm and forest was carefully managed for maximum productivity, irrigated fields in semi-arid regions, and crop varieties specifically developed over generations for local conditions. This was not primitive farming. It was advanced agricultural management, built up over centuries. The slave trade attacked this agricultural system in three ways. First, direct removal of farmers. The working-age men who did the heavy agricultural labor, clearing forest, deep cultivation, construction of field infrastructure, were the primary target of slave traders. Remove the farmers, and the farm capacity falls proportionally. Some scholars estimate agricultural output in severely affected regions fell by 30 to 50% during peak trading periods. Second, the geography of fear. Even communities not directly raided contracted their agricultural footprint. Farming in exposed fields becomes dangerous when raiders could appear at any time. Communities pulled back to areas closer to protection, abandoning fields that had taken generations to develop and that could not simply be reclaimed. Third, the loss of land knowledge. African farming knowledge. Which fields drain well, which crops grow in which soils, which pest management techniques work in which conditions, was embodied in the farmers who had managed that specific land for years. When those farmers were taken, the knowledge was lost with them. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. This is perhaps the dimension of the slave trade's impact that is hardest to quantify, but the 2011 work by Nathan Nunn and Leonard Wanchicon has given us remarkable statistical evidence that the psychological damage was real, substantial, and lasting. Imagine living in a community where the most dangerous thing you can do is participate in public life. Markets are targets for slave raids, so you trade cautiously or not at all. Festivals and gatherings are opportunities for mass capture, so communal celebrations contract or disappear. Farming in exposed fields becomes a risk calculation. Are the crops worth potentially being taken? For generations, not years, but generations, communities in the most severely raided regions of West and Central Africa lived under this chronic threat. And chronic threat reshapes human behavior at the most fundamental level. The most visible social consequence was the destruction of inter-community trust. African communities that had maintained complex diplomatic, commercial, and social relationships with their neighbors for centuries found those relationships replaced by paranoia and defensive hostility, because they couldn't know whether their neighbors were their victims, their protectors, or their betrayers in the slave trading system. And Nunn and Wanchicon's finding is extraordinary. They surveyed contemporary African adults about their levels of trust in government, in neighbors, in relatives, and correlated those survey responses with the historical slave trade intensity of the region those people's ancestors came from. The result, people whose ancestors came from more heavily raided regions, show statistically lower levels of social trust today. 400 years of slave raiding left a psychological mark still detectable in survey data collected in the 21st century. This is the depth of the wound. Let me introduce you to one of the most important pieces of economic research in recent decades, and one that has received far less public attention than it deserves. In 2008, Harvard economist Nathan Nunn published The Long-Term Effects of Africa's Slave Trades in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, one of the world's most prestigious economics journals. His central finding: There is a strong, negative, statistically robust causal relationship between the number of people taken from an African country during the slave trade period and that country's current economic development level. The countries most severely affected by the slave trade are, today, among the poorest countries on earth. And this relationship cannot be explained away by geography, by colonial history, by natural resources, or by other factors. When none controls for all of these, the slave trade impact remains strong and significant. The mechanism. The slave trade destroyed African state capacity. Strong, stable states, with effective governance, reliable legal systems, predictable rule of law, are the foundation of economic development. The slave trade replaced strong African states with fragmented, unstable political environments. And weaker states produce weaker economies, lower investment, lower productivity, lower technology adoption, lower growth, effects that compound over generations. Then Nunn and Wanchicon added the trust dimension in 2011. The slave trade also reduced social trust, which further suppressed economic exchange. Markets work because people trust each other enough to trade. Specialization of labor works because people trust contracts to be honored. The slave trade's destruction of social trust created an economic environment hostile to growth, and that environment has persisted. The bottom line. Nunn estimates that if the slave trade had not occurred, current per capita income in Africa would be approximately 75% higher on average. 75% higher. This is the contemporary economic cost of a historical crime. Political fragmentation is one of the slave trade's most consequential and most enduring legacies in Africa, and it connects directly to contemporary African political challenges in ways that are rarely acknowledged. Before the slave trade, Africa had a record of large, stable states. The Mali Empire covered more than Western Europe. The Songhai Empire governed 25 to 30 million people. The Kingdom of Congo had sophisticated provincial administration. These were real states, with professional bureaucracies, standardized legal systems, organized commercial networks, and the institutional capacity that comes only with scale and stability. The slave trade progressively destroyed this landscape. The gun trade empowered smaller units, giving local warlords and slave trading intermediaries the military capability to challenge central authority. The economic incentives of the slave trade created power centers at the local level that had every commercial reason to undermine the central states that might have controlled or limited the trade. The demographic depletion weakened the tax base, reduced the army, and made central governments progressively less capable of maintaining order. By the time the Berlin Conference happened in 1884, much of Africa that had once been governed by large, stable empires was now a fragmented landscape of smaller, mutually hostile entities. And the colonial borders drawn over this fragmented landscape cut through 177 cultural and linguistic groups. The Yoruba were divided among Nigeria and Benin. The Somali were divided among 5 colonial territories. The Tuareg were divided among 6. These arbitrary divisions, drawn by Europeans with rulers on maps, at a conference where no African was present, have generated border conflicts, ethnic conflicts, and political instability in the post-colonial era that have claimed millions of lives. Trace that political instability back to its origin, the slave trade's destruction of Africa's political order. Let me put the full accounting on the table, the numbers that represent what was taken from Africa. 12.5 million people transported to the Americas. But that's not the full demographic cost. Add the millions who died during capture raids in Africa. Add the millions who died on the march to the coast. Add the millions who died in the slave forts waiting for ships. Add the millions displaced within Africa by the wars and raids the trade generated. The total demographic loss to Africa was probably between 20 and 25 million people, over a continent whose total population was perhaps 100 million at the trade's peak. A 20 to 25% demographic loss, equivalent to removing everyone from Germany or Australia. 447 years. This is the number that makes recovery difficult to imagine. If the slave trade had lasted 20 years, Africa would have recovered. If it had lasted 50 years, recovery would have been challenging but possible. 447 years of continuous disruption, with peaks of tens of thousands of people per year, creates consequences that compound across generations. The children of disrupted communities were born into disrupted circumstances. Their children were born into further disrupted circumstances. By the time the slave trade ended, 10 or more generations of compounding damage had accumulated. $14 to $40 trillion in economic value transferred out of Africa. This includes the uncompensated labor of enslaved Africans in the Americas, which created the capital for the Industrial Revolution and built Western financial systems. It includes the disrupted African commercial economy. It includes the productive capacity that was destroyed. The wealth went somewhere. It went to Europe and the Americas. And Africa has never been compensated for any of it. One of the most specific and most damaging consequences of the slave trade in Africa was the severe gender imbalance it created and the profound impact that imbalance had on African women. Slave traders took men at approximately twice the rate of women. This was driven by demand, Plantation agriculture, particularly sugar production, favored male workers for physically demanding labor. The consequence in Africa was communities in which adult women dramatically outnumbered adult men. Consider what this meant at the community level. The farming, the construction, the herding, the defense, all of which had been primarily male tasks, now had to be performed by a population that was primarily female. African women absorbed responsibilities that had previously been distributed across an adult population of both sexes. They became, by demographic necessity, the primary maintainers of their communities, and they did this while simultaneously being more vulnerable. Without male relatives, fathers, brothers, husbands, sons, women in raided communities had fewer protectors. This increased their vulnerability to subsequent raids and to exploitation by the more powerful political entities that emerged in the slave trade environment. The increase in polygamy in heavily raided regions is often cited as evidence of African cultural deficiency. But the scholarship shows clearly, the increase in polygamy during the slave trade period was a demographic adaptation, not a cultural preference. With adult women significantly outnumbering adult men, polygamous arrangements were a practical response to an extraordinary demographic situation created by external commercial pressure. African women bore the weight of maintaining communities devastated by a trade that specifically targeted their male counterparts. Their resilience made community survival possible. Their vulnerability made community development enormously more difficult. I want to be clear about something. This video, in documenting the damage done to Africa by the slave trade, risks presenting African people as passive victims of an overwhelming external force. They were not. African resistance to the slave trade within Africa was continuous, creative, and often heroic. Queen Nzinga is one of history's most remarkable political leaders. She ruled the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms in what is now Angola, and she fought Portuguese slave trading for 40 years, from her succession in 1624 to her death in 1663. She built military alliances with neighboring kingdoms. She allied with the Dutch, who were in commercial competition with Portugal. She led military campaigns personally. She negotiated with Portuguese governors as a sovereign equal. The chair story is famous and worth retelling. When she arrived to negotiate with the Portuguese governor, he sat in a chair while she was offered a floor mat, a deliberate insult, positioning her as a subordinate. She responded by gesturing to one of her attendants, who immediately knelt on all fours to serve as her throne. She sat on her attendant and conducted the entire negotiation as an equal. She died at 80, in bed, having never been captured and never having surrendered. King Afonso I's 1526 letter is one of the most important anti-slavery documents in history, written in Latin by an African king to a European king, 300 years before the European abolitionist movement. He described the destruction of his country in precise, powerful terms. He was ignored, but he wrote, and the letter survived, and we know about it. The Maroon communities are Africa's most extraordinary cultural achievement in the Americas, communities of self-freed Africans who reconstituted African governance, African language, African spirituality in the forests and mountains of Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil. They were Africa in exile, and they endured. I want to make the case for what I believe is the most important and least understood connection in modern African history. The slave trade and colonialism are not sequential events. They are causally connected. The slave trade created the conditions that made colonialism possible. Think about the timeline. The Atlantic slave trade is suppressed from the 1807 British Slave Trade Act through the 1888 Brazilian abolition. Almost simultaneously, beginning in the 1870s and culminating in the 1884 Berlin Conference, European powers begin systematically colonizing Africa, not after a gap. Immediately. This timing is not a coincidence. European commercial interests in Africa did not disappear when the slave trade was suppressed. They shifted from extracting value through human trafficking to extracting value through direct territorial control and resource extraction. The profits continued. The mechanism changed. And crucially, the Africa that European colonial armies entered in the 1870s and 1880s was a profoundly different place from the Africa that existed before the slave trade began. It had been subjected to 400 years of systematic demographic depletion, political fragmentation, economic disruption, and military destabilization. The kingdoms that might have provided organized military resistance, Mali, Songhai, Congo, Oyo, had been destroyed or severely weakened by the slave trade itself. Ethiopia is the proof. Ethiopia was not seriously involved in the Atlantic slave trade. It maintained its political cohesion, its military capacity, its institutional strength. When Italy attempted to colonize it in 1896, Ethiopia defeated the Italian army comprehensively. An African state that had not been subjected to 400 years of slave trade destruction could resist European colonialism. Africa that had been subjected to it largely could not. Nathan Nunn's research is remarkable not just for its findings but for its methodology. because it addresses the most common objection to arguments about historical causation. How do you know the slave trade caused current poverty, rather than some other variable? Nunn's approach. He used historical slave trading data, assembled from shipping records, oral histories, and other sources, to construct a precise measure of how many enslaved people were taken from each country during the trade. He then correlated this with contemporary income per capita, controlling for geography, colonial history, natural resources, disease environment, and other variables that might independently explain economic differences. The result: a correlation of -0.89 between slave trade intensity and contemporary income per capita. In social science, correlations this strong and this robust to controls are extremely rare. This isn't correlation is not causation territory. This is one of the most precisely established causal relationships in the economics of development. Then Nunn and Wanchakan's trust study. They surveyed 19,000 Africans in 16 countries and asked how much they trusted their neighbors, their relatives, and their government. They matched respondents to the historical slave trade intensity of their ancestral region. The finding: people whose ancestors came from regions more heavily rated by the slave trade show statistically lower trust in all categories, even within family trust. Think about what this means. The psychological damage of 400 years of a trade that required people to betray their neighbors, enslave their kin, and distrust strangers is still statistically detectable in survey responses collected in the 21st century. The wound is still present in the data. And the policy implication: if the slave trade caused Africa's underdevelopment, then treating that underdevelopment as a cultural or internal failure is not just historically wrong, it is a policy error that produces interventions that cannot work. Of all the economic arguments that have been made about the slave trade's impact on Africa, the trust argument is the one I find most intellectually compelling, and the one that offers the deepest explanation of why the damage has been so persistent. Trust is not a soft social concept. It is economic infrastructure. Markets cannot function without trust. If you cannot trust that the person you're trading with will honor the agreement, you won't trade. Specialization of labor cannot function without trust. If you cannot trust the craftsman to produce what you're paying for, you won't pay for it. Government cannot function without trust. If citizens do not trust that the government serves them rather than exploits them, they will not cooperate with government policy. Every economic institution, every market, every financial system, every government depends, at its foundation, on trust between people. And the slave trade systematically destroyed the foundations of trust in the most heavily affected regions. How? Through the specific mechanism of betrayal. The slave trade required African people to enslave other African people. Neighbors raided neighbors. Leaders sold their own subjects. Trading partners handed over their trading partners. Family members betrayed family members, because the slave trade created conditions in which such betrayals were, from the betrayer's perspective, rational survival choices. Over 400 years of this, repeated, normalized, embedded, and the rational default becomes distrust. If your neighbor might raid you, if your leader might sell you, if your trading partner might hand you over, then the rational response is to trust no one, to keep your dealings limited to your immediate family, to maintain defensive hostility towards strangers. And Nunn and Wanchakan's finding: this distrust was transmitted across generations as a learned cultural adaptation. The danger passed, but the learned response to danger persisted. This is the hidden wound of the slave trade, still present in African social data today. One of the less discussed but significant dimensions of the slave trade's impact on Africa is its environmental and agricultural legacy, how it disrupted Africa's millennia-old relationship with its own land. African agriculture at its pre-slave trade peak was sophisticated and productive. West African agroforestry systems, where the farm was a carefully managed forest rather than a cleared field, were highly productive and ecologically sustainable. Complex polycultures maintained soil fertility over long periods without requiring the inputs that European monoculture farming demanded. Irrigation systems managed scarce water resources in semi-arid regions. Seed selection programs had developed crop varieties specific to local conditions. This was not primitive farming. This was advanced land management, built up over centuries of careful observation and experimentation. The slave trade disrupted this system in multiple ways. The most direct, by removing the farmers and agricultural specialists who held the knowledge of which varieties to plant in which fields, how to manage drainage, how to restore soil fertility, how to manage the forest for maximum productivity. All of this was embodied in the people who had spent their lives developing and practicing it. When those people were taken, the knowledge was lost with them. A less obvious but equally important effect: the fear geography of land use. Communities under slave raiding pressure pulled back from their most exposed and most productive fields. Permanent investments in land improvement, terracing, irrigation channels, managed groves, were abandoned when the communities maintaining them fled or were destroyed. And then colonialism imposed monoculture cash crop agriculture on top of this already disrupted system. Grow cotton for British textile mills. grow cocoa for European chocolate companies, grow groundnuts for European soap manufacturers. African food security was subordinated to European commercial needs. I want to consider one more dimension of what the slave trade took from Africa. The people who were taken, and the generations of their descendants, represent a permanent loss of human capital that has never been returned or compensated. When modern workers emigrate from Africa for economic opportunities in Europe or North America, they maintain connections. They send remittances, they return for visits, they stay connected to their communities, they sometimes return permanently. Their immigration represents a loss to Africa, but a partial and often reversible one. The slave trade was nothing like this. The 12.5 million Africans transported to the Americas left permanently. The connections to their specific communities, to the villages, the families, the kingdoms they came from, were severed completely. Within a generation, most enslaved Africans in the Americas could not name their community of origin, their language, their lineage. The severance was total. The descendants of those 12.5 million, now numbering 200 million across the Americas, represent 200 million people's worth of human potential, creativity, and cultural knowledge that never developed in Africa, never contributed to African economic development, never maintained the African communities that were depleted by the trade. And the paradox: in the Americas, African culture was not destroyed, it was transformed. The Yoruba religious traditions that were disrupted in West Africa by the slave trade and colonial pressures survived in Brazil as candomblé and in Cuba as Santeria. The musical traditions of West Africa, preserved in the bodies of enslaved Africans, became jazz, blues, gospel, hip-hop, reggae, the most globally influential music of the past century. Africa lost the people. The people preserved the culture, and the culture went on to shape the world. Let me bring this to the present, because the most important thing I want you to understand from today's video is that the slave trade's consequences for Africa are not historical. They are contemporary. GDP per capita. The correlation between slave trade intensity and current income is -0.89 in Nunn's study. This is one of the strongest relationships in the empirical economics of development. The countries most severely affected by the slave trade are, today, among the poorest countries on earth, not because of anything in their contemporary culture or governance, but because of what was done to them 200 to 400 years ago. Institutional quality, strong institutions, reliable rule of law, effective administration, accountable governance, are the foundation of long-run economic development. The slave trade destroyed the large, stable African states that had developed these institutional capacities over centuries, and replaced them with fragmented, weak political entities. Contemporary African institutional weakness is not an African cultural characteristic. It is the predictable consequence of 400 years of systematic destruction of African institutional capacity. Ethnic conflict, the political fragmentation created by the slave trade, amplified by colonial borders drawn without regard for African political realities, created conditions for ethnic conflict that have claimed millions of lives in the post-colonial era. When you lock historically hostile groups together within borders that give them no mechanism for negotiating their relationship, conflict is not surprising. It is structural. Low institutional trust. African societies show lower levels of institutional trust than comparable developing societies. This is not a cultural attribute. It is the learned legacy of institutions, chiefs, traders, rulers, that spent 400 years being instruments of exploitation rather than protection. 5 myths. Direct answers. Myth 1. Africa's problems are self-inflicted. Correlation of -0.89 between slave trade intensity and current GDP. Established causal relationship. Not an excuse, an empirical fact. Myth 2. Africans sold other Africans, equally responsible. The demand, the infrastructure, the legal framework, and the racial permanence of the Atlantic slave trade were European. African participation was frequently coerced by the gun trade's arms race. Equal responsibility is not the same as any responsibility. Myth 3. Enough time has passed to recover. 447 years of disruption across 15 to 20 generations. Nunn's effects are still statistically measurable in contemporary data. 400 years of compounding damage does not recover in 2 generations of independence. Myth 4. Pre-colonial Africa was stagnant anyway. Timbuktu. 25,000 university students when Oxford had 1,500. Mali Empire. 1.29 million square kilometers. Congo. Diplomatic peers with Portugal. Swahili Coast. Chinese porcelain in 14th century Kenyan soil. This was not stagnation. This was a developmental trajectory that the slave trade interrupted. Myth 5. The Arab trade is equally responsible. The Atlantic trade was more intense over a shorter period, specifically targeted working-age men, and its demographic and political consequences are what Nunn's research measures. Both trades caused harm. The Atlantic trade's specific measurable economic impact is what the evidence addresses. Your reference card. Looking at this table, a few things stand out. The duration row, 447 years, 15 to 20 generations. Recovery from this scale of disruption is not rapid. The GDP impact, minus 0.89 correlation, 75% income loss estimate. This is contemporary, not historical. The trust row, descendants of heavily rated regions show less trust today. The psychological damage is measurable in 21st century survey data. The colonial border legacy, 177 cultural groups cut by arbitrary borders. The political instability of contemporary Africa has its origin in these borders, which in turn have their origin in the slave trade's weakening of Africa that made the Berlin Conference possible. And the King Afonso I row, 1526. He wrote. He was ignored. The letter survived. We know about it. 8 takeaways. 1. The damage operated across 9 dimensions simultaneously, not one wound. 9 compounding wounds, reinforcing each other. 2. 12.5 million taken, 2-to-1 male ratio, working age selection. Destroyed farming, defense, craft, and knowledge simultaneously. 3. The guns for slaves spiral. European arms created an arms race in which every African kingdom was forced to raid or be raided. Continental political order destroyed. 4. Nathan Nunn's finding. Minus 0.89 correlation. 75% income loss estimate. Contemporary, not historical, consequence. 5. Nunn and Wanchicon. Lower trust still measurable in 21st century survey data. 400 years of betrayal embedded in contemporary African social behavior. 6. The slave trade was colonialism's precondition. Ethiopia as proof, unconquered Africa could resist. Conquered Africa had been weakened for 400 years. 7. Africa resisted. Queen Nzinga, King Afonso I Maroon communities. African women. The resistance was continuous and creative. 8. Contemporary African challenges are documented, measurable consequences of historical crimes, not cultural or internal failures. This changes everything about how we should think about African development. The evidence we've covered today is not merely historical. It has direct implications for how the world should relate to Africa right now. First, acknowledge the causal chain. The standard question in development economics, why is Africa poor, is not wrong, but the standard framing of possible answers, corruption, governance failures, cultural factors, geography, systematically omits the answer that the empirical evidence most strongly supports. The slave trade caused measurable, demonstrable, persistent economic damage. Any discussion of African development that does not include this causal factor is incomplete at best and misleading at worst. Second, reparative justice. I want to be precise about what this means. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for the application of the same legal principles that everyone agrees apply to other cases of documented harm. If someone steals from you and benefits from what they stole, and you can demonstrate that the theft caused your current economic situation, then restitution is the ordinary legal consequence. The slave trade is a case where all of these conditions are met. CARICOM's 2013 request to European governments is not radical. It is legally coherent. Third, fair trade and structural equity. The cocoa and coffee paradoxes are not natural market outcomes. They reflect trade structures that were built during the colonial period to extract maximum value from African raw material production. Changing these structures, ensuring that African countries can add value through processing, manufacturing, and branding, is the economic equivalent of ending the slave trade's extractive logic. Fourth, fund African agency. The development economics literature shows clearly that the problem in Africa is historical external damage, not internal cultural failure. This means the solution must be African-designed and African-led, not a continuation of the external expert-knows-best model that has characterized most international development for 60 years. Africa was not underdeveloped. Africa was deliberately underdeveloped. This is not a political slogan. It is the conclusion of rigorous economic research, published in the world's leading academic journals, demonstrating a causal relationship between what was done to Africa and the condition of Africa today. Nathan Nunn's data. Minus 0.89 correlation between slave trade intensity and current income. If the slave trade had not occurred, African income per capita would be approximately 75% higher today. Nunn and Wanchicon's data. Descendants of people from heavily rated regions show measurably lower social trust today. The psychological damage of 400 years of betrayal is still detectable in 21st century survey responses. The slave trade took 12.5 million people, the most productive, the strongest, the most skilled. It took 447 years of developmental momentum. It destroyed the kingdoms, Congo, Oyo, Songhai, that had the institutional capacity to develop Africa independently. It broke the trust between communities, that is the foundation of commerce and governance. It paved the road that colonialism walked in on. King Afonso I of Congo wrote to the Portuguese king in 1526, "Our land is entirely depopulated." He saw it happening. He named it precisely. He was ignored. Queen Nzinga fought for 40 years and was never defeated. The maroon communities of Jamaica and Suriname built free African societies in the mountains and forests. The women of raided communities held together what remained. Africa never simply accepted what was done to it. And Africa endures. 2.5 billion Africans by 2050. The world's largest working age population. The AFCFTA, 54 countries building a continental market. Afrobeats as the world's fastest growing music genre. African scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, artists creating the 21st century. Africa endured. Africa resisted. Africa is rising. Subscribe to Griot Wave Academy. Share this video. And the next time someone asks why Africa is poor, give them the real answer. Asante Sana. Thank you. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.